Ave Maris Stella.
Hello and welcome back to Vatican II in a Year. This is your host, Father Matthew Schneider. I am a priest of the Legionaries of Christ and I teach theology. This is a podcast on the Star Christ Production Network at sqpn.com. Today we're on day 294. We're giving a general overview to Gaudium and Spes, the last document. Previously, I interviewed people for the various documents in Jerusalem, but several interviews fell through for this document, and I thought it best just to do it myself. This is the document I know best as well, so it worked out that way. If you want to follow along, we have a reading plan and more details at sqpn.com/Vatican and frmatthewlc.com/Vatican. As a side note, this is probably the longest gap I've done between recording. It's been like a month and a half because I had things the scheduling and maybe later, and it just didn't work out. So we have a lot of Vatican II documents out there. We've obviously been going through them chronologically by publication date. This is the last one. And Gaudium et Spes is Latin for joy and hope. It is subtitled The Pastoral Constitution of the Modern World. This is really what it's about. So it's about the social doctrine. It's about how we bring Jesus into the world. And it's the biggest document in the council. And it was approved by 2,307 to 75. So a 97% approval rating. A little reminder of my qualifications. I have a STD or STHE, Sacred Theology Doctorate in Moral Theology. They do not offer subfields on the degree itself, but if there was a subfield, it would probably be in social doctrine, which is really what this document is most about. Currently, I teach and I'm a priestly formator at Holy Apostles College and Seminary in Connecticut. To introduce Gaudium et Spes, we have 5 parts which we'll deal with today. First, the historical relationship between the Church and the State. Second, important magisterium in the 100 years before Vatican II. Third, key themes of Gaudium et Spes. Fourth, 9 chapters of Gaudium et Spes over 2 parts. And fifth, more recent social encyclicals. This is the longest document, as I noted. It is about 72 days of this podcast. So we're starting at the end of October, and this goes all the way to the end of December. It's our last document. The second longest is Lumen Gentium. That was 48 days. And we had 2 introductions because I treated Chapter 8 as a separate document on Mary. So we had Dr. Shawn Blanchard talking about the church ecclesiology for chapters 1 to 7, then Dr. Mark Miavile about Chapter 8 about Mary. So that is kind of an introduction. Our first topic today is church-state relations. Obviously, due to limited time, we're just going to speak in broad strokes. We're going to speak in broad strokes here today. Catholicism really started off as an offshoot of Judaism in the Roman Empire. At first, they were really united, and they slowly developed a different relationship, and they had a different relationship with the state than the Jews did. If we think about the Jews in the Roman Empire, they were accepted, and they were allowed to worship their God so long as they paid their taxes and things like that. And then after the destruction of the temple and Jerusalem in 70 AD, the Christians and Jews generally split. It wasn't an instantaneous thing, but that's generally the most key date in that split. We go back to the Gospels, and what does Jesus say? Jesus says, "Render unto Caesar what is Caesar's, and render to God what is God's." When he sees the Roman coin, talking about taxes. And so this represents a view that Christians respect the state. Christians respect the government. They don't come on and do their own state thing, their own government thing. Then they're also a persecuted minority. They were not they were not a group that had everything they wanted. No, they were persecuted. We look at all the persecutions, all the martyrs of the early church, and we see that. And even amidst those martyrdom, the church and the members of the church were faithful to the various other laws that did not require offering sacrifices to Caesar or Jupiter or other things like that. Then we had a change in the 300s. The church went from this persecuted minority to the official state religion of the Roman Empire. There's a few stages to this. We often think of Constantine when he saw the sign, usually considered the key rho, the PX sign, in the sky, and he put it on his soldiers' things to win the battle of the Milvian Bridge. And that is really the first stage, but that only made it acceptable. The real thing was in 380, there was the Edict of Thessalonica, which made it the official religion of the Roman Empire. Now, Christians need to determine how we are going to rule, not just how we are going to be ruled, how we are going to be good citizens, but now how we're going to be good governors, how we're going to be good politicians, how we're going to be good administrators of public funds, things like that, which are a new reality for Christians because we never had this before. And over time, Rome fell. And what happened after that? We have the Middle Ages. And in the Middle Ages, the Pope was both a secular king and a spiritual leader in Western Europe. What kind of relationship was that? Well, the whole Middle Ages, at least the early Middle Ages, was based mainly on feudal oaths, where you would make an oath to your local duke or whatever, and he would make an oath to the king, and those would be how they would structure the feudal society. And ultimately, the kings would make oaths to the Pope as the ultimate authority there. So that's what we have in this time with the beginning of the Middle Ages, the early Middle Ages. There's a slight variation as time goes on in the Middle Ages, but that's the point. That's the general idea. And here we have a very closely working church and state, where the Pope even crowns Charlemagne, the Holy Roman Emperor, and there is a very close relationship with the government there, where the feudal lord, the feudal king, makes an oath of fidelity, a feudal oath to the Pope. And at the same time, we have over in the east the Patriarch Constantinople and the Eastern Roman Emperor, the Byzantine Emperor, and they have a little bit of a different challenge. They have what can be called a throne and altar alliance, where the throne, the emperor, and the altar, the Patriarch Constantinople, have an alliance. But what ends up happening is the emperor is constantly trying to exercise his authority over the patriarch because he really wants to be in charge. He wants to rule religion. This was something new in Christianity, to have a religion separate from the state. This seems like the most normal thing today, but it was not historically. Historically, most of the time, the leader, the king, the emperor, the pharaoh was the highest priest of the religion. The religion and the state were much more connected even than we were talking about in medieval Europe. But in Christianity, we have the church, and it has its authority, and the state, and it has its authority. And the challenge for Christian rulers can be to try and overstep their authority in the state and take the authority of the church from the church. And more recently, after this period of the Middle Ages in Western Europe and the Byzantine Emperor, we have the Renaissance and the Enlightenment. We have modern nation-states. And the church has to operate in this new modern global order. How is the church related to states now? Generally, we've had a separate church and state, which is good. But sometimes that can go too far, where the church is simply the spiritual reality. The church loses its aspect of being a witness beyond just the spirituality, saying, hey, this is what is just, how to treat the poor justly and not unjustly. Here is how we need to exercise authority so we aren't overstepping the authority of parents and families. And that can be a challenge. At the same time, this is when we see the great missionary expansion of the church from that Mediterranean basin and Europe, for the most part, to all corners of the world, where there are Christians in basically every country in the world. And one of the challenges in this missionary activity, not necessarily this mission activity, but in this activity of spreading all over, is there can be that confusion because oftentimes the missionaries came at the behest of or somehow allied with the conquering authority. And there can be a confusion of religion when the priest comes with this new conqueror who conquers your king and puts your area under the Spanish or British or English king. Well, I'm accepting this for political gain, or I'm accepting this for other reasons. And we need to move that to the spiritual reasons to be Catholic. We also can have the church get caught up in some of the abuses of that expansion, of the great expansion to the whole world, of the European powers. And that can be a challenge. This brings us to the 20th century and the church-state relations, which we've all seen in our own lives in the last 100 or so years. Now, we move on to our second topic in preparing for reading all of Gaudium and Spes. And this topic is the magisterium before Gaudium et Spes, the magisterium in the 75 or so years before this encyclical. And this starts with Leo XIII. It's the first of 4 encyclicals we'll deal with here. So in 1891, Leo XIII published Rerum Novarum on the new things. And this, being the first social encyclical, set a new important area. In fact, this is so important that our current Pope, Leo XIV, noted this encyclical as a big reason why he chose the name Leo. So let's give a quick summary of it. We're not going to go into depth. This would be a whole other topic. But I think it's important to realize that it kind of forms this kind of balance between socialism and the denial of private property and this laissez-faire capitalism, which says the government, the company can do whatever it wants. The company can put you in there for 16-hour days, paying you almost nothing and things like that. And that you have a right to a union, a right to strike, right to a wage, things like that. And it is this response to industrialization, because what happened? In industrialization, we see that there is these excesses of some of the companies in how they treat workers. They're employing 12-year-olds and things like that as well. And one of the big responses is socialism. But the church is saying, no, neither that nor socialism. We have to look at something based on the dignity of the workers. And this is where Leo XIII has a great insight. And this is the first of what is generally called the social encyclicals. It's not the first time the church talked about this, but it's the first really systematic topic, discussion of this topic of a society after industrialization and things like that. Now, second, in 1931, Pius XI published Quadragesimo Anno on the 40th anniversary. And this is not the most discussed social encyclical, but there are a few things that are important in it. And one of the things here is it expands this idea of private property. It expands this idea, need for private property to have our freedom and things like that. And it talks about how we determine fair wages so that somebody working full-time can support kids at home and things like that. And that's important when we look at how we should pay workers in Catholic charities, pay workers in companies, pay workers, and all these different things. And this is all based on the idea of the common good. At the same time, it's rejecting the more modern approaches to socialism, specifically communism, which really came about in Eastern Europe and Russia in between Rerum Novarum and Quadragesimo Anno. Now, just before the council, John the 23rd published 2 social encyclicals. In 1961, he published Mater et Magister, Mother and Teacher, and then in 1963, Pacem in Terris, Peace on Earth. And I want to go over a little bit what they add to the magisterium. So, the first one is Mater et Magister, and it's really saying we need a church that works towards authentic community. We want it to promote human dignity. This human dignity, this based on being the image and likeness of God, is a key theme of Catholic social doctrine. When I teach this class in the seminary, I spend at least a whole class, if not a whole week, talking about human dignity and that it's intrinsic, that it's based on being the image and likeness of God, and it isn't based on anything we acquire, like the ability to talk or the ability to think or things like that, but it's based on being human. And this is really an encyclical that makes that point important. And it also says, hey, the church can sometimes interfere. Now, moving on to Pacem in Terris, it is more about the international order and the larger questions, not the little individual local questions. Russell Hittinger describes this encyclical as a kind of Magna Carta of the Catholic Church's position on human rights and natural law, because this presents all these different aspects of this wider perspective of how we deal with human rights, how we deal with natural law. Because natural law is a participation in the eternal law of God. It's what we perceive, what we understand through perceiving the reality that we see. Oh, humans need food. Humans need sexual relations to reproduce, but they need a family to raise those children. So we can't just reproduce wildly and things like that. And so these are the kind of things that it talks about. And it's really obviously has that aspect of peace as a big part of it. So this gives us the magisterium coming up to Gaudium et Spes, coming up to Vatican II. Moving on to our third topic to introduce Gaudium et Spes, we are going to talk about the major themes. These are 6 themes that I think are important and I think are well represented throughout the encyclical. There are certain sub-themes we might talk about in the next topic on the outline. And the first one of these themes is the idea that the encyclical is addressed to all humanity, not just the church. And so a lot of what this encyclical is saying is natural law, not just things that are based on this is what the Bible says, this is what tradition says. No, but this is based on what it means to be human. And that's where we get the natural law. And we're talking about what it means to be human. So this is an important aspect that we're talking to everybody. And we're not just talking to the church. If you look at church documents, you can look at the ones that are more and less precisely audienced, or they're two more or less precisely audiences. You look at things like Veritatis Splendor, which is very specifically to bishops and theologians. You look at a lot of others that are to a much wider audience because they're much more for everyone else to read. I would not tell the average person in the pew to go and pick up Veritatis Splendor on their own without understanding a little bit of the background and a little bit of some basis of moral theology. I've taught Veritatis Splendor, and I'll teach it again, but I'm not going to give it to some middle schooler. There are church documents I would give straight to a middle schooler to read. The second thing is that what we are talking about in this encyclical are what can be called secular in quotation marks, topics. Well, how does politics work? How does economics work? Those seem very secular topics. Well, why can the church talk about this? How does the church have something to say about economics? That's not a Catholic topic. You're right, it's not a specifically Catholic topic. There's not Catholic economics per se. But there is something we can say about the ethics of it. There is something we can say about the people involved in it, because all the people who are involved in economics, in accounting, in politics, they're all made in the image and likeness of God. So the church can talk to man, to those images and likenesses of God, about what it means to be an image and likeness of God in this particular area of life. And that's how the church can speak on these topics and why the church speak on these topics. In fact, one of the things that is really interesting is the church sees this social doctrine as something which she can present for evangelization, because this brings people to the church, hopefully. Now, the third major theme is that Jesus is the answer to all. And this theme is most expressed in one quotation, not a quotation mark, but comes throughout the whole document. And I'm going to read the quotation in probably the most famous paragraph of this whole encyclical, which is Gaudium Spes 22. And let's read it. The truth is that only in the mystery of the incarnate word does the mystery of man take on light. For Adam, the first man, was figure of him who was to come, namely Christ the Lord. Christ, the final Adam, by revelation of the mystery of the Father and his love, fully reveals man to man himself and makes his supreme calling clear. We see here that Jesus is the answer to everything. Our lives as human beings only make sense in Jesus. Only in the mystery of the incarnate word does the mystery of man take on light, as the Council Fathers say. So this is a reality we have to be aware of. We make our calling clear. The final Adam, which is another name for Christ, reveals us to ourselves. We are fully understood in our humanity through Christ, the model, the image. We are images of the Father in the one true image of God, the Son, because a son is the image of his father, right? You look at kids, and they are very much like their parents. You can sometimes guess who the parent is in a group because you look at the kid, and the kid looks exactly like the parent. Doesn't always work perfectly, especially if you're dealing with things like, I have siblings where two cousins look closer to each other than two siblings do in my niece and nephews, but that's a little bit of an exception because it's family, so we all have they both have the same grandparents, my own parents, right? And so this is really important that Jesus is the core, Jesus is the center. Jesus is what we do everything for, who we do everything for, why we're here, why this all matters. The fourth topic is not so much a topic, but a posture and attitude. Vatican I and a lot of the church teaching in the time of Pius IX, Leo XIII in the 1800s tended to be very defensive, very hold off. Let's build the fortress church away from the world. But what the Council Fathers are saying is, no, let's build the church and move the church into the world. Let's not build this fortress apart from the world. Obviously, we need things that are apart from the world. We are going to have our sanctuaries. We are going to have our seminaries, things like that. But let's move the church into the world, into the things of man, so that the church can speak to that. The fifth topic here, or theme, is really this idea of laity. You all have an important role in bringing the secular world to Jesus. This is a mode of evangelization, and this is a mode specifically, for the most part, to laity. It's not my role as a priest to go into a company and do the accounting and show, hey, this is Catholic accounting. This is so much better for the dignity of our workers and things like that. That's not my job as a priest. Now, obviously, as a priest and a moral theology professor, I can explain it to you, but I'm not going to go into that company and be a union leader or be an accountant to say, hey, we need to pay workers more for a just wage, things like that. Now, the final theme is that the church must scrutinize the signs of the times. We in the church have to look for the signs of the times and respond with the gospel. The gospel is a message for every time, but it's not necessarily going to be the exact same message, because we have our culture that's overly sexualized. It has all its issues, and we need to respond to this culture. We need to bring Jesus to this culture. We don't need to bring Jesus to a pre-industrial culture. I remember reading a few lives of saints who lived before the Industrial Revolution, and certain aspects didn't really speak to me because they were doing what was good in their society, but it didn't really make sense in our post-industrial society or even in industrial society. So those are the 6 major themes of Gaudium et Spes, that it's addressed to all humanity, that man has dignity because it's made in the image and likeness of God, that Jesus is the answer to all, that the church is less defensive and more open to the world, more bringing the Jesus into the world, the role of the laity in that 4th one, and then 6th, the church must scrutinize the signs of the times. Now we move on to the 4th area that we have to cover in preparing for Gaudium et Spes, and this is an outline of the document. There are 2 parts, and in those 2 parts, 9 chapters total for this document. And I am going to rely partially on the summary made by Father Rich Conlon. He has a blog, the Prodigal Catholic blog, and he has a good summary of it. I'll link it in the description. I am not going to quote him verbatim. I might use some of his text and things like that, but I think his is a very good outline of it. And so if you want to read it, it's also very similar. I read it and I said, this is more or less what I remember, and I just look at it as I have it here in front of me, rather than trying to remake my own summary, because he had such a good summary. So the first part is the introduction. What is the situation of men in the world? The church wants to look for the signs of the times, light of the gospel. How are we going to present the gospel to these new people? It talks about the new society realities that are coming at this time. You're having the beginning of the sexual revolution. You're having the atomic age. At this point, the Apollo project is ongoing. Things like that we need to look at. And we also, with that, we have the preface where it's talking about the human person. And this is being the point of contact, that we're all persons, we're all made in the image and likeness of God. Then moving on, we talk about part 1, the church and man's calling, which Father Conlon calls the doctrinal part, which I think is an accurate way of describing it. It's talking about how we read the signs of time today, but it's also talking about what does it mean to be human? What are the principles of the church's social doctrine that we need to represent today, responding to the signs of the times? And it's, in many ways, the area that is more relevant today, 60 years later, than some of the other areas, because this area is more timeless. So the first chapter in here is the dignity of the human person. This goes back to one of those themes I talked about, that idea of man is made in the image and likeness of God, and our intrinsic dignity based on being human, not extrinsic based on some kind of quality or attribute. And that's an important thing, that our dignity is based on being human. So whether it's the unborn human, the sick human, the elderly human, the mentally disabled human, it's all human, all has intrinsic dignity. So the second chapter here is the community of mankind. And we are meant to be in community as humans. Even when we go back to Genesis, God does not just make Adam, he makes Adam and Eve. Whereas Genesis 1 says, male and female, he created them. And there is that sense of community that comes from the beginning. We are meant to community, we're meant to live in equality, we're meant to live in union with our neighbors and things like that. And this is really just presenting that both locally and more broadly. Chapter 3 of Part 1 is man's activities throughout the world. And this is where we look at things like technology. And we look at technology more generally. How does man rule the world with technology? What does it mean that we have dominion over plants and animals and space and time in the way we do today? And this is a real challenge that we have to look at for how we present the gospel anew. Part 1, Chapter 4 is the role of the church in the modern world. So this goes back a lot to Lumen Gentium. It really links the two, talking about how the church is not just this heavenly kingdom, this heavenly community. No, the church has a role to be leaven in our society. The church is meant to renew society from within, especially through our lay members. And this is an important thing, that we do not think of the church just as a spiritual reality, but as a reality that spreads further out. And that concludes Part 1. Part 2 is titled Some Problems of Special Urgency. And with that title, we get the sense that this is more specific issues that they're dealing with at the time in 1965 when this document was approved. The first one, Chapter 1, I think is a topic we are still dealing with today, and I think in many ways more so today than they were in 1965, which is fostering the nobility of marriage in the family. That's the chapter title. And this idea that we have marriage as a covenant that's based on the unitive and procreative meanings of sexual union and of parenting and family. And that is important because the family started to be attacked. There was a big movement here for birth control. Now, Paul VI, who was the Pope at the time, said, look, let's leave birth control off here. And he would publish Humanae Vitae 3 years later to really talk about birth control. So birth control is not explicitly dealt with here, but is kind of the background because that's where a lot of the ideas that we can have sexual relationships outside of marriage without consequences, without kids and things like that come from. And so that is a reality that was big now, and I think is even bigger today because we also have other issues of recognizing marriage is not really marriage between two people of the same sex, or things like that. And we have no-fault divorce, where you can get a divorce just because you don't feel like it, and you don't suffer the consequences for seeking a divorce like that. Marriage is different from every other type of contract in society, because in every other type of contract, if one party decides to break the contract unilaterally, they get the short end of the stick when the negotiations go. But in marriage, no, that's not considered. And that's what's called no-fault divorce. We just get divorced. We don't look at who was at fault, whether one person was cheating or abusive or anything like that. So moving on to Part 2, Chapter 2, which is titled The Proper Development of Culture, which is really important. It defines culture as all that goes towards refining and developing of humanity's diverse mental and physical endowments. So this culture is wider than we might just think of Spanish culture, Irish culture, or the media or things like that, but it's the whole way we live, and it really serves that whole person. And we need to recognize the dignity of each person in that today, the dignity of each culture as well, and the good things of all the cultures, along with corrections that certain cultures need to have. Part 2, Chapter 3 talks about economic and social life. How can we talk about the dignity of the human person in economic systems? There should be economic development to help the poor people, whether it's poor nations or poor individuals in wealthier nations. And we need principles for governing economics so that it's just. We shouldn't just make up the rules as we go along. We should think out beforehand and make the just rules, make the just help to others for economic development. Part 2, Chapter 4 talks about the life of the political community. And this talks about how it exists for the common good. The church does not favor any one form of government, but insists that all government should safeguard the transcendence of the human person. This is important. We need to have politics. Politics are good. Politics are important. But politics need to seek the common good. Politics need to respect the dignity of the person. Now, finally, our final chapter, part 2, chapter 5, is titled The Foster of Peace and the Promotion of a Community of Nations. This is where we deal with things like the nuclear bomb. We deal with things like how we can avoid war. And this is really valuable because, honestly, in the past 60 years, we've had one of the, in many ways, the most peaceful times of human history. We've had a lot less wars, in many ways. Even though we've had wars, the number who've died as a proportion of humans around has been lower. And so that is a valuable thing to think about and think how we can keep preventing wars going forward. And so this concludes our summary of the outline of Gaudium et Spes and brings us to our final point, which is the magisterium after Vatican II, the social encyclicals that continue on, and the other aspects of the church that continue on after Vatican II. Looking at the time from Vatican II to today, we see a whole series of social encyclicals. Paul VI wrote 1, St. John Paul II wrote 3, Benedict wrote 1, Francis wrote 2, and Leo XIV has promised at least one on AI. I can't really comment on Leo's yet. I honestly think it will be pretty valuable, but we haven't seen it yet, so we can't comment on it. But I think there are a few of these that are particularly important. First of all, Laborem Exercens on human work is an encyclical by John Paul II that talks about how human work is intrinsically dignified. We have dignity in transforming this world. It is good for man to work and not just sit around and receive social assistance or sit around and do nothing or sit around and relax. No, but we develop the world, and that is a good thing for us as human beings. Another aspect that was really developed from Vatican II in these social encyclicals was the environmental aspect. Benedict built this up in the encyclicals and then in other speeches, so much he was called the Green Pope, but then Francis, one of his 2 encyclicals was Laudato Si, which was really on the environment primarily. And so these are some of the important developments. Beyond that, we see a lot of the same themes of dignified work and labor and just economics, neither laissez-faire capitalism or socialism, and that idea of balance. Because in a lot of these things, what the church teaches is not a specific economic policy. It teaches more, here are the guardrails. Don't go outside these. Each country or each state or each area of the world or the world as a whole needs to determine within those which works best for it. We're just saying, here are the ones that are unjust. There are several just ways to do this, and you, as the government or whatever, can try and figure that out for your people because there are differences in different societies, and that will have different ones being good or bad in that society. I know even for myself, living in Canada and in the US, there are differences in society, minor ones, between these 2 countries, that result in slightly different ways that it's governed and things like that. Neither one is just or unjust. For example, in the US, you have a separate election for the president. In Canada, just whoever gets the most seats in the House, the leader of that party becomes the prime minister. I don't think that there's a clear one or the other of those is just. Both are reasonable ways for a country to pick its government via an election. And we need to see that as these kind of limits where we can't go outside and we can't have dictators and things like that. Another aspect that I think is important, that is in the kind of air, is the dialogue that the church has with politics and with science. I think that there is a big move for the church to be in that dialogue with politics and science that is really valuable to build the church up and valuable for the church to dialogue with the world. One of the things we have today is the Vatican has a permanent observer status at the UN, and it actually contributes quite a bit. I was reading recently they made a very good contribution on the idea of autonomous weapons. They've done a lot for human rights around the world and things like that, for protecting marriage, for all those different things. And that's a valuable thing to present a Catholic perspective even there. And we'll regularly have statements by the Vatican or the USCCB, the USCCB being the United States Conference of Catholic Bishops, on key issues. telling us, hey, this is how Catholics view this. This is how the church views this. Not saying this is what you must believe, but saying, okay, this is not just. Not saying this is the only just way to do it, but this particular policy would not be just. And we also have things like the Pontifical Academy of Science. How does the church look at science? How does the church deal with science? You have directly the Pontifical Academy of Science, but then you have how we look at science more generally. I know, for example, I'm teaching creation as part half of one of my classes this semester, and we've talked a lot about the science of evolution. We haven't gone into making it a biology class, but we've done it a lot in dialogue with the biology there, because that's helpful to understand the world today and for the church to dialogue with the world. We see a lot of things brought into seminary training. We have social science, we have psychology brought in. That's very helpful to train seminarians, to train Catholic sisters, Catholic colleges, things like that. And I think there's a lot of ways that really come back to Gaudium et Spes that have really transformed the church for the better in the past 60 years. And I think these are valuable. And I think we need to continue this on and not switch back to a kind of fortress mentality of the church. Now, for an individual family, maybe you would want a little bit more of a fortress. And that's a family decision to be made by you and your spouse. I'm not stepping in there. But as a church as a whole, we are stepping out into the world. We are trying to bring the world to Jesus and bring Jesus to the world. And that's really what the overarching idea of Gaudium et Spes is. So, usually I have a time here for my guests to promote stuff. So since I am basically interviewing myself, I'll promote my own things. This year, I am possibly the only person in the United States who lives in one seminary and teaches full-time in another. LC Cheshire, CHESHIRE.org, has Life of the Legionary Seminarians, where I live, and information if you want to discern with the Legion. holyapostles.edu has a bunch of online classes. I teach almost exclusively on-campus classes, so if you're looking at the online classes, I will almost definitely not be your teacher. And the on-campus classes are mainly sisters and seminarians, not lay people. Both those you can find in the show notes. So thank you for listening to this episode of Vatican II in a Year. This is a listener-supported podcast. You can donate to help StarQuest boost it and other great podcasts at sqpn.com/give. You can give one-time monthly or join the StarQuest Patreon. Tomorrow we'll start reading Gaudium et Spes with paragraphs 1 to 2 on the Church Speaks to All Human Realities. Please join us then to learn more about Vatican II, which provide a blueprint for the Catholic Church. If you want more information, please go to sqpn.com/Vatican, frmatthewlc.com/Vatican, or Vatican SQPN on Facebook and X, and there you'll find things like playlists for individual documents and a reading plan. There's also an SQPN Discord server with a channel for Vatican II in a Year at sqpn.com/Discord.